Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai ki te rakaho o te Aotearoa, and welcome everybody who's online as well as those who are in the audience to this seminar. It's my real pleasure to welcome Mick Abbott here. Mick and I have in the past worked together on a couple of books on landscape, which sort of cemented our joint passion for different ways of looking at the world that we live in. And Mick at that stage was at Otago University in the School of Design, and then moved on to Lincoln University, where he's now a professor in landscape architecture. And as well as that, Mick has a business where he works actively with landowners, with iwi, with DOC, and with others on some absolutely amazing landscape design enterprises and activities, which I think he's going to talk about today. And I'm just really excited to have Mick here. He's spending quite a lot of time back in Otago at the moment, so it's a really nice opportunity for us to rekindle those connections and look for future opportunities to work together. So I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you, Mick.
Thanks, Jenna, and thanks everyone. Thank you online there. What I wanted to talk about today is really just probably a survey of sort of the investigations we've been doing in design-directed research, very much looking at how we might sort of work at that nexus of how we activate people, how we activate nature, and how that might operate. I come from a discipline that's design-based, so I'll take you through that. There's quite a visual presentation with quite a few slides that I sort of flick through. A lot of this material you can find online as well and look at it at your leisure. When I speak here, I'm not just speaking in terms of the work that I've been involved in. Most of the work is collaborative. There's been a host of people that have been part of our team in developing this. Likewise, a host of partners that we've worked with, and also various workshops, symposia and conferences, which have sort of created that ecosystem of work that we've been involved in. I've titled this Investigations in Regenerative Design, and the reason for that is there's a wonderful sort of reciprocity between the idea of how we might design landscape, design nature, how we might think of behaviour change, how we might work in that space as well. Often design is focused on that activating nature space in terms of spatial disciplines, landscape architecture, those fields. But where it gets really exciting, I think, is when it focuses very much on what is the role of people in that place and thinking in terms of that. And I'm sorry about the way this keeps sliding across rather than going flip. My keynote went that way, but we'll get used to that. But I think the most exciting thing that I'm finding most exciting and stimulating the work I'm involved in is this sort of shift that I see it's always there, but sensing its potential, particularly in Aotearoa, from people shaping nature to nature shaping people, and how we might directly focus on that capacity for nature to make us better people and to transform ourselves, and what is the way we might nudge that. And so that's where it's been worked at. So this is just a brief outline of what I'll take you through. Really, when I said investigations, they're kind of like little snapshots each one. They do link, but I'll just sort of take you through that. Context, this is an image I took on the Kepler track last May, or 2 Mays ago. We were, just when we came out of lockdown, a whole host of feathers, even though the trail is heavily tracked, obviously is stowed. And I think it's that sense of disorientation that we often have, wondering how do we operate in this space. This is just being in Hong Kong. You think of the energy grid that's supplying these things to keep people cool, the sort of the non-virtuous cycle that cascades impacts. Or here in Norway, going through a 26-kilometre long tunnel, which is, the country that's focused on renewables, but is funding that out of funding that's come from other sources as such, and the dichotomies and dilemmas in that. Here, flying to Antarctica and work doing there with Antarctica New Zealand, and again looking at ice shelves when we came back. Having penguin in the cargo cabin, going to a zoo in San Diego, and just finding these things quite difficult. Here, looking down on Milford's McKinnon Pass the Milford Track. And again, you know, that sort of relationship of how we connect with nature and tourism industry and the debates we're having at the moment, as we're in COVID, thinking beyond that, what is the type of virtuous tourism that we might be able to aspire to? This is an image I took in the Shetland Islands. It's a fascinating image. The Shetlands, if you know of it, has no trees left other than one small patch. It did have trees as such. This is a stone wall cottage. A stone wall put around, a small plantation of pine trees. And it's kind of like a microcosm as such. But it's also a story of whakapapa. This is where my great-grandfather was born. This is a place where they said the fires never went out for 200 years. This is the old croft there looking out to here, and what is a desolate environment as such. And that's what sort of prompted him to come over to this country. From another side, in terms of my whakapapa, looking at, came over as well and set up a nursery and sort of things being sold, fruit trees, forest trees, shrubs, roses, you know, this transforming of Aotearoa of Christchurch into something else. And here we sort of see the sort of the fruits of this sort of work as well. And so those sort of dichotomies as such, that at that same time, you know, the way that the land was being understood. This is Makero's survey map of southern Fiordland. I sort of focused a lot on this when I did my doctoral research. And I was fascinated in terms of this, you know, this tabulation of land into saying, you know, there's this many square miles of pasture, this is forest, this is barren, this is swamp. It's like drafting sheep, this sort of relationship that says it's this or it's this or it's that. And that's really what we've inherited. And Jeff Park, you know, this is a quote I keep coming back to, but it still was relevant. This sort of mindset that we've sort of, in our heads, divided nature and our sort of society into two parts. And he says, in one, in which most of us live, one of the most dramatic transformations nature anywhere has taken place. And in the other, it's a land apart from people. And I've sort of studied this at length, and, you know, you see this here at various eco-sanctuaries, sort of the role of fences to say within is this sort of endemic nature that is authentic, outside is this sort of like negotiated space where we're not sure. This is some of the products that I was involved with designing when I worked as an equipment designer, but again, it's like landing on the moon. Nothing here is needed in the environment for me to unload my pack and take all of those things in terms of that. Or even if you look at the management of our conservation lands, like, you know, all the facilities are brought in, treated timber, Pinus radiata, full of chromium, cadmium and arsenic as such, and that's what's constructed as well, this kind of standing apart. But that lens really doesn't hold much more, you know, that sort of two landscapes. The world is changing rapidly, and if we look here at the Mackenzie Basin, we could say up the top here is orientation. Is it working? I won't worry. Up along the top here is public conservation land. We could say that that's that landscape. Here is farmland, so that's that other landscape. And yet, and here is some of the more interesting ecological aspects that, while they're microcosms, small areas, holds a lot of value. And in the back, maybe that's quite compromised, rapidly changing too through climate change. Even here into Fiordland, these places are heavily compromised without investments of people and effort and trapping and what have you. And so this sort of two landscape lens is not, while it holds in our minds, it's not actually what's playing out in our environment. So I want to start with sort of some investigations within that. Footprints, this is an article that I wrote in one of the books that Janet and Jacinta Ruru edited. It's called Being Landscape. And the question I asked in this was these footprints here. Were these footprints part of me, or were they part of the landscape? And could you make that distinction between those? And in that space, what's not necessarily the issue, but what's the opportunity in seeing them as both? Are both part of myself and part of the landscape. Going to Lincoln, those footprints became footprints in the soil more than footprints in the snow. And the potential, particularly as we grow and what we might plant, including planting our feed, planting plants, such, what becomes possible in terms of that. These are students that working with out of Aotearoa, planting taiwa, and this connection about what we might create, which is part of people, which is part of the soil. What is that potential that's created in that space? This was a project that worked with out in Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. This is conservation land where we the department was very. I really admire the fact that they were prepared to give this a go. A very overt planting regime put in there in public conservation land. Normally we plant faux Gondwana, so that it looks as though it's what we imagine Gondwana is, which means there's no people in it. But here it's a very overt representation of people, but really it's kids being brought in here. You can see all the vehicle tracks, these kids, local kids and others from the community planting through here and creating an outdoor area, but also to sort of ensure that other vehicles don't go travelling along there. And here it is as it's been growing up over time, and the planting is now increasing all around, such that pattern planting will disappear. But what it is it's a catalyst for creating this regime of planting in the place. And it was an article that we wrote in Landscape Research based on this too, about counter-ontologies. John Wiley talks about sort of ecological, about homeland thinking in terms of, attachment in Europe to sort of like, I have a longer connection to place than someone else, and how people assert that. That equally there's challenges in this country, and in our article we were exploring how, this assertion of going back to an origin of Gondwana land, in many ways it's it's laden with different sort of cultural associations of why go back to that space, and what are the potentials to go forward, and how might we express that sort of negotiations and go ahead. So what are those future attachments to place? Looking at ideas of going in terms of nature, in terms of wilderness, an area I've sort of focused a lot at in time. This was looking at the possibility of that. I've been fascinated with William Cronin's work in terms of his analysis of the myth of wilderness, that somehow we can leave nature untouched by our passage, that it's not possible, that it's a constructed idea, but every time we're there, we're actually involved in it. We might choose not to put ourselves in the picture, but nonetheless we are. He's an environmental historian. His challenge back from his analysis was to say we need to decide what marks we wish to leave. As a designer, I'm thinking more forward, and it's what is the act of mark making? What are the footprints I want to make rather than what are the footprints I want to leave, and how might we do that? Work from the Department of Conservation, surveying people, what do they do in public conservation lands? And the walking for less than 3 hours, walking for over 3 hours, sightseeing, walking, camping, etc. It's a very much a recreation, walking through nature type of experience. I'd also add that within that is sort of an imaginative paucity in terms of the idea of visiting, that, you go to a place and visit, and then you go back again to something else, and then you come back to the place and visit some more and back again. And it really is missing out on other dimensions. Interestingly, the same people surveyed were asked what's the benefits of conservation, preserving, protecting the environment, protecting, saving species, protecting the environment for future generations, sustainability, much deeper values than just saying I want to go for a walk. And the opportunity in terms of that, of becoming part of this country's conservation mission. So instead of saying that the role of our conservation lands is to provide opportunities to visit, it's actually to become part of something, to belong to something, to move on, so that visiting is just a transitional condition in that relationship that we might want to create. And so some of the work that involved with that, this was work done on Punakaiki, where we looked at what was a former mining site owned by Rio Tinto that was then given back into conservation land. The potential for this to rejoin the national park through the impact of people. And so through a planting regime and a walking configuration, how could that be developed? And a nursery that was made of volunteers for volunteers. That this is a sort of a way of actually people's impacts being harnessed in a beneficial way, rather than in a way where we say people are always going to compromise that environment. Some of the work we did in terms of mapping out experiences over time as well. Work in Aotearoa, where there's a story of you go to Aotearoa and you go into the caves and you see moa bones, and we have this mindset that moa, puakai, haast eagle, are something from our distant past, that they're fossils from millions of years ago. They're from much more recent than that, and the opportunity to tell a story of past extinctions is a challenge to avoid future extinctions. And so how we might invite new audiences in through that. And so we had using apps to animate silhouettes so that you can see the feather structures as such, take selfies so you can understand the size of the eagle, share that with others to engage new audiences into that conservation challenge. But as you walk back, you're diverted down a different path through a large container that's set up as a life-size tracking tunnel. And you learn about Theo and Keo protection work in that place. And so this is how you can support, be involved in that. And so the conservation is a sort of a message of involvement rather than a message of information. Extending that into Arthur's Pass, work done with the Department of Conservation, looking at how the village itself might be a conservation hub. So that its opportunities there is to be a place where you engage with what it means to be involved with protection, that again it's an induction and an introduction into this country's conservation mission, translating that down into the visitor centre, looking at also how that might be, and having things like conservation DIY, so how do you go home and again set up your own sort of restoration values in the places that you live. So that the purpose of the sort of protected areas is an incubator for how we might engage back home with those values rather than an escape from just the paradoxes and dilemmas that we see. Other work here, this Wild Heart project is really an extension of that first one I showed you with Punakaiki, where we didn't have the resources to construct that. So what we created was a web-based opportunity for people to then volunteer and come to these places. And we launched it just before COVID started, so it's sitting there in limbo ready because it's focused very much on internationals coming in and saying, hey, come and be part of what we might be able to imagine. Work also done with the Department of Conservation on children's program. This became the pilot for Kiwi Guardians and sort of recruiting, and out of that pilot they were able to recruit significant corporate support. But all of those sort of opportunities in a virtual sense as well, that interaction with people, so concepts for a planting app, which isn't about showing the plants, it's about showing the people who have planted. So as you drive by, you see this forest of people who have been involved in this forest of plants. And so again, those footprints in the snow, that sort of reciprocity showing there. Again, work we've done enabled Tasman looking at crowdsourcing citizen science, a virtual visitor centre. So rather than building a building, it's there in your phone. So then sort of taking that sort of sense of, and I've always been interested, I suppose, in protected areas because even the slightest mark is noticeable. And it gives you a clarity about what you're observing. But I mean, those things are everywhere. And here we can see, this is where our place is up on Mount Cargill. Again, an article written in another book with Janet and Jacinta, in terms of that, looking at, the social life and stone walls. And, it's easy to look at these stone walls as being interesting artefacts, and the Dunedin City Council back then saw them as sort of representative and expressive of Scottish heritage settler sentiments. But in each of these stone walls has been a tree wrapped in it. This is a view, just our place over there, a view of 1864 of the forest that was there, looking out into the harbour. And so each of these rocks has got that within them as well. Also in the straight lines, you can see the survey line. So it's to do with cutting up pieces of land If you know also about some of the people who were, who were centred in Eden as convicts, you can think of Parihaka, and so political prison dimensions as well were involved with construction of these as well, some along the seawall. Here at Stanleydale in the Shetland Islands, again, there's sort of so many dimensions to this, such that like the footprints in the snow, you can't separate the stone from all of that social life that's within that. I find it easier to explain that when this is a design. This is a chapel built in Germany by Peter Zumter, designed this, where it's working with the local monks and the community. They chopped down a whole lot of trees from the forest and then set up formwork and slowly filled it up with concrete over time. And then when it reached a certain height, lit it and lit the trees. And this is the negative space caused by the trees. And so that form is created that way. And so this is inside here. If you can imagine your trees going all the way up here, sticks, and then burnt through that chimney, which is this here. And so now it's a chapel, just a simple chapel. How do you separate the people from that nature? Social natures, and our sociability based in nature. And so the potential with that. Likewise, just our stone wall, when a truck backed into it by mistake, dispersed the wall, and you can see I've just put it back a bit rudimentarily, but in there, a whole lot of beer bottles. Yeah, they finished the wall before they finished. Hey, let's have a party on Friday night, and then they put the beer bottles back in there. All done, job finished. And so those dimensions are all part of that. And so these are some of the things we've been exploring in certain projects. This is a project in the landscape design for Marian College up in Christchurch. So the Catholic Cathedral demolished, looking at some of that material and repurposing that. Within that, we can take that sort of view of sort of looking past and looking forward. And I find the work, particularly from Donna Haraway, and that's managed to do that, and Anna Tsing. Sorry about that, I've hybridised. I was thinking, yeah, sorry about that. But what's fascinating is we look at this, as we can see the stone from this wall coming to here, but what's even more interesting, I think, and we're sort of just doing a bit of work on that at the moment, looking at the limestone going further back. So this is a turtle, a turtle fossil found in one of the rubble from another church and out of the earthquakes, and how that is carried forward in terms of its life as well. In that sort of sense that we're just trying to negotiate those relationships in an ongoing way. We sort of focus more so on planting. This is the school design, which really isn't so much about the planting plan, but about the role of creating different relationships between the students and those plants. So some of those values that sort of echo what was in that Department of Conservation work, and also sort of a literacy based on that. Other work with Regenerative Christchurch in terms of looking at the Avon River, the Aotearoa, how that might open up possibilities as a garden city, but about replanting a distributed forest through that based on native plants. Reworking perhaps some of the work that my great-great-grandfather was involved in. Or work here with Tim Smith and the Eden project, as they were looking again at what might be possible in the red zone area. And so some of the design work we did, this is all the planting regime, which again you can look at in the footprints in the snow or footprints in the soil as a spatial planting. But each of these, again, is designed to be grown and planted by community. And so an expression of that relationship. I should have just added quickly here too that this here is really set up so that different families and supporters of the school can take these plants, and this is just under construction now, the buildings, but they can go and organise finding these plants, be growing them at home for the next 2 years, and then when it's ready to plant, be coming in and planting and creating that event and social space. So a bit like the beer bottles around the stone wall, that potential again, how we might activate And then this work, which we've done with the New Zealand Walking Access Commission, looking at tracks and trail strategy for the area between Hamilton and Auckland City, particularly up in here, and what could be possible. I mean, it's a fast thoroughfare, 4-laning rail corridor, everything happening. And what we're trying to sort of articulate through this work is shifting from seeing trails and roads and routes as infrastructure and connections, which they are, but see them as social devices to create people, place and connections, to create sort of values of belonging, and particularly with rapidly changing populations and growing populations, that these sort of pathways into belonging and connection are invaluable in what they can produce. And so how to approach that, in a normal sense, you would think, well, we'll start looking at the tracks and trails, but, we're very much closely guided by Evie in this, and this is the most wonderful description of a river, and it's out of the Settlement Act, but it's the river is a single indivisible being, and I really hold that view indivisible, and I think that holds so much promise and potential for us, that understanding of nature, of what we might call various things. The indivisibility is so powerful, and that it includes so much. And this is sort of our poor graphical representation of that, but at least it's taking it outside of that central channel aspect. And so the idea of how we might connect communities back to the Awa, and then from that create connections along the river in terms of that. And so we created a strategy working with local government as well, that was first and foremost about supporting the work of the vision of the Waikato River Authority, and so for a future where it sustains an abundant life and prosperous communities. And so how might that health be restored, and what's the role of a trail in doing that? And rather than thinking, do we need trails for tourism and to attract visitors, what's the building block of that relationship, which comes back to a connection with environment. And so this is just where we took modelling. It's in some ways it's sort of a digestible form of Tim Ringgold's landscape tarscape models, but where we looked at growing habitats and what's that building block through here, and then connecting communities, and then out of that building economy. But there's a sort of a building block relationship in terms of that, rather than just going, what's the thing we need here to create economic value? And so how can that be developed? So then just moving on to this, which is looking more at productive landscapes, farming relationships, and some of the work we've been involved in here. This is Paul Carter's work. I don't know if you've come across it in The Road to Botany Bay, but he looks a lot about mapping. And it's a very interesting analysis he brings. This is called poverty. He named this Poverty Bay, and he named this the Bay of Plenty. And people think he named it Poverty Bay because that's what he thought it looked like. But actually he did this naming in Indonesia later. He arrived in a state of poverty, did his circumnavigation, and left in a state of plenty. And I think that this notion of sort of that how we see a place is quite powerful. And we've sat through various politicians over the years who have said that, hey, we can choose to be pretty or poor. Yeah, we can either be this or that, but we can't somehow sort of understand that the plenty of what belongs here is something that can make us rich as well. And so that's often used as a debate about mining or resource extraction, etc., etc. And this is also a project that was done by a North American landscape architect, Thomas Waltz, which looked at, it was involved in a location just, it was called Young Nick Station. It was quite in the news a while back, but it was purchased and they did a number of things on that property. And I did a critique of that because working in the field of landscape design, there's this real sense that all we have to do is to produce exemplars. These are the example pieces of how we might see the world should be. And I think we should be much more motivated to produce catalysts, to say our part is within that, and how do we create those interventions that might lead to those snowball effects rather than isolate ourselves into areas. That the idea that landscapes themselves don't have to be profitable, that somehow they're these nice pieces that are almost like giant hobby farms. But ultimately, if we can make sustainable landscapes profitable, then they can attract investment rather than just taking profits from other investments that people might have, such as the owners, of different people might bring into that. And it sort of plays that need to actually see if we can make that relationship both sustainable and profitable is quite important. And then aesthetics over provenance, that how something looks or appears is much less important than the actual sort of genuine sort of knowledge of those ecological rucksacks or those environmental rucksacks or all of those things that are going in there. A lot of those things I felt were ignored in that design. I think this is an image that they showed, and I think it's exemplary of the challenge we have. It's in many ways that Jeff Parkin just showed of Manapuri and Te Aia area, that if I was to ask you here, what is the productive land and what is the protected land, we would say, we're taught to say that's the protected, that's the productive. But what if we said this was the productive and this is a temporary holding pattern until we can shift the fence over here so that the productive land can keep extending out? What is our potential in terms of productivity there? And you can think of the work that's being done by Tane's Tree Trust and so on, in terms of looking at totara and other species in that. But again, we've sort of got ourselves into this is where we do our farming, this is where we do that. And I suppose the work that I've been involved in has been looking at, well, what's an experimental approach? How do we extend outside of our property boundaries rather than just within those areas? And how do we bring native species into productive systems? And how do we bring some of those wider goals in there? Questions, not necessarily answers in terms of that. But this is work we did with Ngāi Tahu farming. We were invited in as landscape architects to say, could you come up with some gateway designs for that? We came back a couple of weeks later with some sketches and saying, well, we think the gateway is something that's experienced not necessarily as you're driving into the property. And so we did these sketches of this as the Canterbury Plains as it was, the centre pivots, what's that potential to express that relationship with the Waimaka area, and what's the potential in terms of planting. And so this is a project we work with them, 1.3 million native trees being planted through this development, about halfway through, I think, and sort of the potential of creating corridors along there, potential for sort of bridges across the plains as well, maybe because you couldn't do this sort of bringing back of native species without irrigation. The wind is too harsh, the land, the soil is too bony. And then coming down to some quite detailed sort of specifics of how that might take place. Other work we've done working in the vineyard sector, because again, the stories of provenance and those stories of relationship to land generate direct value in wine, are very sensitive to those appeals. And so how might that relationship also happen? And so here at Pyramid Valley, looking at the relationship with limestone, with tussock as water catches, if you think of Sarah Mark's work, where the vineyards actually go. And here we've planted thickets of totara through the property as the future fence posts for this organic farm, so that the saplings can be used for that rather than using macrocarpal bitumen or using steel and so on. So that there's a productive dimension to what's going on in that place. Likewise, looking at phasing, looking at sort of those ideas of multifunctional landscapes and what might be possible. This is another project up at Greenland in Hawke's Bay. And here work we've been doing with Yealands, sort of a sustained body of work with them. And, they have the largest single vineyard in the country, 1,400 hectare property, 1,000 hectares of that in vineyard. And then the rest, the rest is sort of, grazed, not suitable for vineyard, but what to do in these places. And that area has been heavily modified. And also it's sort of, if you look at the modelling looking ahead, a lot of uncertainty in terms of even what might be the climatic conditions that might be coming. And how do you go to that? Because a restoration that looks back could be quite naive in terms of that, and there isn't necessarily much available to draw on in terms of that. But they're heavily committed in terms of sustainability. They harvest their prunings and use that to fire their generate electricity. Very strong commitment through that. We came up with a landscape strategy which didn't just look at the property, but looked at the relationship of the property to the whole catchment, into the Aotearoa, looked at a master plan and thinking of specific projects and phasing that would take place within that. I want to just show you one part of that, which is looking at some planting along that hillside area in here, the space looking back, what we might do. And what we did was we did a very heavily articulated design with a lot of variety. And that's not from an aesthetic point of view. It's actually because we're not sure about what will actually go well in this environment. And so what we have to do is to create a range of ecotones through that and let, just as that pattern planting the Aotearoa is now taking over into other things, get something established, and then let's see what plays out in terms of that. It does allow us to tell some distinctive stories that can link back to wine values and the different sort of the distinctive ecotones, but equally where we have a base planting and then put different plants to complement that as we go through. And likewise looking at the wetland environment as well. Just want to talk quickly about cartographies. You know, in every field, we're also aware of our methods and processes. I love this image of the country. It sort of reminds me of sort of much more relaxed, easy chair that you might lean against, yeah? Rather than the north to south angst, or if we're feeling a bit insecure, we can always put ourselves further to the top. But this sort of notion of how we might represent, how we might draw, how we might diagram is very important in the field I'm involved in. And we're always cognizant of those potentials here, working with students. Here's a research studio, but it's sort of the tools of our trade. This image has a number of overtones. The fact that someone might in the 1920s think something was unexplored just because it was unexplored to them shows a certain naivety. But nonetheless, what's interesting about this map is when this was published, what does the unexplored at present do? It causes everyone to go there. And in our work, we're looking to create those tools. How do we create the diagrams that work like unexplored at present so things take place? And so that's something we focus quite heavily on. This is work we did again with Walking Access Commission, looking at a Matakana coast tracks and trails strategy. And this was the work we were doing, and I have to be frank that it was work that we were doing, but we hadn't quite nailed it, and there was a certain concern for us in that. And we were very kindly guided by iwi about seeing things differently. And these images, which I showed back to the community trust that had been driving this project, sort of saying, what is common in your area? And we showed these images and they came up with, you know, what's the ocean, it's this, it's that, it's this, it's that. And what we had been shown is we showed these images from said, do you notice what's in every image? Said, Hatu. That's how you know this place. And so actually orientating our map. Yeah. And actually when you're in this region is defined by the fact that you have a relationship with Aotearoa. And so the trails here have that relationship even though they're not actually walking there. And it shifts things quite fundamentally, and that then opened up what that strategy might become. And it took it to a deeper set of values which take you back more to those belonging ones and being part of something rather than just infrastructure ones. Work done for the Associate Minister of Conservation, looking at this country. We tend to see it as very small on the planet. We're actually provide governance for 2.3% of the planet's area. Our land area is about 1/40th of that. But how might we create a conservation transept that spans, a fifth of the circumference of the planet? What's possible in terms of that? How might we graphically show on those somewhat mundane maps of the IUCN put together, that this is a place that people value? how might we express those values of kaitiakitanga? And when you think that we don't have the human resources to be able to defend that, or the military resources, it's actually through expressing our conservation values and saying to the world, please leave us to do our job here. It's probably the strongest strategic position as well. Department of Conservation understanding its role in the blue world as well. So transforming its logo to not just be land and waters, but also marine one. And how might we express that graphically as well? Sort of some of the other work that we do, sort of, using a creative dimension to express complex relationships. So the rain shadow in the Mackenzie Basin, sort of tussock, and they're able to create and offer. Here looking at Lake Pikaki and saying, well, look, these are the current challenges, but let's step back. What did that landscape look like before the lake was raised, and so on? So creating those visual tools that can, I think, be more democratic and allowing many people to understand things rather than having to read graphs and reports and what have you. Scenario development work, this was where we sort of looked at the fact we worked with researchers in Wageningen and said if the Netherlands was to turn up in Canterbury and we had 15 million people to deal with, how would we deal with that? And the idea of using landscape forms to create our city forms rather than landscapes around cities, what might they become? And this is work by my colleague Woody Lee within the lab. Again, if we go back to that work in the Waikato, we were taking some of the work come out of here actually and thinking how might we describe that specifically within Tim Ingold's modelling. We weren't looking here to describe it accurately, we were just looking at what are the relationships that are going on between the activities people do versus the sort of the more environmental forms that are out there and how might they play out. The reason for that, we're looking for other processes to stimulate our design process, and so then went back to that project which we'd finished earlier and said what would a more task-based sort of activity, practice-based investigation of this opportunity have opened up? What had we left out? And it was fascinating. We found quite a lot of potential in there. And so this sort of looking for tools and methods is also part of what we do. Likewise, in work done in the Mackenzie Basin, Tanahuna area, considering ideas of a distributed protected areas through that, which was fed into subsequent report that was done in terms of that. This is a fraught image. The reason is it represents, from an ecologist's point of view, fragmentation. From a farmer's point of view, it represents a pathway into a different set of values. And there's not much alignment. And so it causes us to sort of consider what are other ways we might graphically represent landscape beyond those sort of tonal blocks and so on. This is work done at Guyhill Station. I just bring this up because we have a relationship there at the Nature Centre, and that's a facility that's freely available for researchers. So, if you're doing research in that area, there's accommodation. It's a new facility. It's sort of excellent. Just let me know more if you'd like. And this is sort of, if you're aware of the work done in sort of we will be socio-ecological approaches in terms of landscapes. And we were looking at protected areas. We have a strong relationship also with Tsinghua University, and this sort of understanding protected areas through those different lenses of islands, networks, landscapes, and socio-ecological systems. We did an exhibition a few years back in Beijing, which presented the protected areas of this country to a Chinese audience because they're looking at sort of a national model of how to create a protected area infrastructure. And so this was part of that. We've got an online version of this, both in dual language as well. What it brings up though, and what was the most fascinating thing, was actually not this exchange, but the one thing that brought the most questions. And also, I have to say, in my work, I'm involved with IUCN, sort of in the national committee here. The thing that actually created the most interest was this, landscape beings. If you think in terms of that, not landscape beings, but what's taken place in Te Aotearoa, this sort of sense that it was difficult to understand. 1952 to 2014 as a national park. Then what? did it get taken into something less? And of course, that's not the case at all. It's been it's created a pathway into something else, and I think that this is probably the most fascinating area of potential in our relationship with our environment in terms of this country. If you look at the Conservation Act, I've always found this difficult. We can do all these things provided it's not inconsistent. Really, it should be that it is consistent. Yeah, if you go home and said to your partner, "I do not love you," it's cause for conversation. Yeah, they mean quite different things. And I think that when I just would strongly advocate reading Te Kawa Aotearoa, the management plan. It's just the most, one of the more important documents in land management in this country. And this is part of that, looking for consistent relationships, looking for how the spirit of the place is liberated out of our social and human constructs, that it's about the management of people for the benefit of the land, not the other way around. And the potential for that in other areas as well. And so sort of see this sort of circle in my own thinking, and taking place in terms of that. And in my role, I was chair for 3 years of the Canterbury Aotearoa Conservation Board, and doing this, the statutory review of the management plan there, which is still a process ongoing. And I found this so difficult that a Te Puni site was able to put a blue margin around it, like a tennis court, ball is in, the ball is out, that really misses the spirit of what is being imagined in terms of that. And that thinking was in work we did with, again, up in Taranaki, looking at a tracks and trails strategy for there. And, if you think of conservation land, and people think, oh, well, that's Taranaki. And drawing this image here, opening up our thinking and the team in terms of that, and these are just all the rivers going right out into the ocean and understanding the Mauna extends right out. And so from that, drawing a trail strategy, that is all about creating pathways around the mountain rather than needing to create them on top of the mountain. And since then, we've been engaged on the Taranaki crossing experience design work, and so we're working actively in that process as well. And so creating a movement of people around the mountain, and the promise of being connected to that which deeply belongs here, the Mana and Taranaki. And so those motivations for having trails are based on that. Just sort of finish up with this though, because it's easy to see that sort of sense of place, sort of the big picture, like the sort of the large, what I would call in my inadequate lens, landscape forms, but these break down much smaller as well. And so this working again up in the Waikato with a whānau trust, working with MB in terms of restoring and returning this environment as well. And so what becomes possible in terms of that relationship and that very intimate relationship and reciprocity and exchange and all of those dimensions that come through and how that can evolve over time. Or as I come back to where I live, the trees that are now starting to wrap again the stone walls, and we'll break those stone walls again. And in time, this will be a picture, we hope, in the future, and not just one in the past, and what becomes possible in that. So I just finished with the notion of design activating nature. That's sort of the dominant lens in terms of the disciplines I've been involved in: landscape design, landscape architecture, and so on. But really it's about the potential to be activating people and that potential, which offers so much. So, thank you.
Wow, so much food for thought. I love the idea of the corridors and the phasing of restoration of landscapes, and from the Alpine, sort of work we've been doing on the Alpine fault, the sort of coupling of the geophysical and the climate, the hydrological realms, I suppose. It's really fascinating to people because we often say we wouldn't have the Alpine Fault, we wouldn't have our beautiful landscape without the fault, having driven up the mountains, then creating the barrier for the weather and the big rainfall on the west coast and the temperate rainforests and all of that stuff. And I think for a lot of people, they don't see that bigger picture connection of landscape, weather, you know. And so in terms of the future, with changing climate, with potential for invasive species and the changing vegetation and all of that stuff, there's so much scope for the work you do in terms of how we design, you know, how we can restore landscapes, put in corridors for, you know, connections across. I love that. It's so interesting. So it's not really a question.
No, but I think, I mean, what we tend to do, because what I'm showing you is sort of finished outputs, but it's really what we bring as a process, and what we're trying to enable is good choice making. And so we create a lot of different representations to say, well, it could look like this, it could look like this, it could look like this. What do those possibilities open up into what we could be thinking of in terms of that? You know, because often we just tend to, I think, take a view that the present is just, the future is just an extension of today's present, and we look for trends that go in those directions, but that it's all right to sort of just lob in the most disruptive possibilities and say, well, could we work towards that?
Thanks. Apologies for turning up late, but I'm really interested in the work you're doing with on wine in particular. And I've been thinking about it in relation to all of the lifestyle blocks that we've got out our way. One of the things that housing on previous pasture land has done is bring in a lot of trees as well. And yet they're still suburban because you need a car to get to and from and to get you to and off in the neighbourhoods. And if you're thinking about the wine developments, I think to Aotearoa and the idea of longitudinal place-based production that has all those relationships and comes from a peasant tradition. And what it looks like, and I'd like to know more, it looks as though there's been a lot of money thrown into the wine sector and trying to make beautiful things, and it will have biodiversity value, but is it going to have all those other, is it still going to have the suburban, you know, you've got to drive here, you haven't got all the other services, you've got to where you house your workers when you've got to do the grab harvest. Are those dimensions included in it, or is it just a sort of an aesthetic with biodiversity?
Well, I think those things are always a spectrum in terms of that. I think the interesting thing is if you think of farming as trying to create value from the land, you know, as a broad description, I suppose it's like people are doing that in different ways. And I suppose our work is trying to align things towards more, I suppose, beneficial ways in terms of that. But we're working in a messy world full of dilemmas and paradoxes, and we're working with the people who want to work with us in terms of that. I don't think there's sort of that big telescope view that you can stand back out of. And so, but what we do find is if we're working at that sort of trying to find ways to be a catalyst, to sort of say to work with my target farmers, where, you know, they came and literally wanted us just to come up with some gateways. And, you know, within a space of a few days, they said, actually, no, we want to do this. And so I think there's an appetite to sort of see a different way. And, you know, that's not universal, but there are a lot of people there who out in industry and community and EU who are really excited about seeing the possibility of things positive. You know, coming back, I think we're not always doing ourselves a service by seeing the future always through a lens of difficulty and always insurmountable challenge. Yes, there are some difficulties, huge difficulties in the century, and huge challenges that may actually be insurmountable. But if we always orientate towards that mindset, it might stop us seeing possibilities as well.
Yeah, I guess on that one thing that because I'm always thinking climate change. And I think I mentioned this to you earlier, but I'm really intrigued by how our coastal and estuarine areas will increasingly change as climate changes and we get more extreme weather events, we get sea level rise, we get places like the Tyrrhene Plain resalinising, and we get coastlines eroding. And it seems to me that there is an opportunity there too to rethink what the Tyrrhene Plain might become in a productive and positive sense, rather than a scene of desolation and poverty-stricken farmers who can't raise cows anymore, but in fact might be a productive wetland that absorbs carbon. And how can we start envisaging those kind of opportunities along with landowners to make this a positive journey?
Exactly, and also understanding that sea level change is not going to stop.
No.
And so it's kind of like a slow-moving engine of transformation that we have to live within.
Exactly.
And so how does that become, that sort of interstitial space become actually a powerful place of possibility, rather than, we sit there and just sort of fingers in the dike hoping against hope that somehow we can just maintain our current ideas or land use. And I mean that you think then of Christchurch as being right in the thick of that.
Yeah.
And what makes Christchurch fascinating in the area is that it suffered half a metre of, suffered the wrong word, but it experienced half a metre of sea level change in one event with the earthquake, because it dropped half a metre. And in that drop from the earthquake, it just changed the conditions of that place. So you can see the challenges that have come to Christchurch since the earthquake in terms of that sort of estuarine environment are hugely revealing of what we can anticipate in 60 years' time. So, and so, and that's sort of what we were trying to engage with the Eden project in terms of what is that possibility in terms of that along that whole water corridor.
Oh, we're going to officially stop.
Yes.
To be continued.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anyway, thank you so much, Mick. It was really fascinating, and food for many more conversations.